What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today, as I'm sure you can tell by the title, I have got a pretty massive video for you guys, as we are going to be going back through the last 12 months of Star Wars Battlefront 2, and I will be breaking down each and every piece of content that we got, all the changes, improvements and bug fixes that we got, as well as taking a look at the more negative side and going through a heap of bugs that we saw as well. Essentially just a year in review for Star Wars Battlefront 2. Now, I have actually done one of these for the first year of the game as well, so for those who want to see what the whole lifespan of the game looks like, then you can also compare both videos to see everything all at once. Before we do get stuck into it, I have to give a massive shout out to two people for helping me out with this video. First of all, my guy Vic, who some of you may know from the Discord or the streams. He actually did about 95% of the research for this video, spending a solid amount of hours going through every single developer post on the forum in the last 12 months, taking note of all the content, bugs and improvements, and pretty much sending it all to me in a Word document. So a massive thank you to you, Vic. You were an absolute lifesaver for all those hours that you saved me. Secondly, and I'm not going to name names just so that people don't hassle him for the same kind of help, but one of the DICE employees actually did help out with the designs you're about to see as well by sending me the background and the fonts and stuff like that. So if you are watching, you know who you are, and thank you very much for your help with that as well. I'm sure you guys will be able to tell just how much work I've put into this video by the end of it, so if you do end up enjoying it, I would love it if you guys could smash that like button and help support the channel. But with all of that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and get stuck right into the complete timeline of Star Wars Battlefront 2's second year of the live service. So starting off of course with December, since I did touch on November in last year's version, and this month was just coming off a pretty massive month in which we were given Obi-Wan as well as Geonosis, plus of course a few new vehicles and stuff like that, so the month prior to this was a pretty massive month. December saw the General Kenobi skin added for Obi-Wan, which is of course the armoured appearance from the Clone Wars TV series, and this was definitely a fan favourite and still to this day probably one of my personal favourite skins in the game. In terms of any improvements, we did see a few small changes to Obi-Wan's animations as well, pretty much just cleaning up some stuff like his dodge, jump and attack animations, and essentially just making him a little bit smoother. On top of that, Geonosis did also see a few changes throughout the map, just mainly some improvements to its appearances as well as some areas where players were getting stuck on the environment and stuff like that. As for bugs that either came with the update or were there previously, there were a lot of issues with Grievous's ability still, as he was of course added 2 months prior to this update, as well as a pretty severe issue where players could shoot and block while they were knocked down, pretty much rendering a lot of knockdown abilities useless. And on top of that, there were just some smaller bugs as well, a few of which you can see on screen. Now overall, the December update was really small in terms of content. The reason behind this is obviously being Christmas time, DICE ended up taking their holidays around this time, and I do remember a large portion of the community being actually pretty angry about this, but it was probably about 50-50, with half the community being annoyed about the lack of content, whereas the other half was understanding that the devs are people too, and they do deserve some time off just like the rest of us. Overall, definitely not the best update we've received, but the months prior to this and the upcoming months were pretty massive, so overall I don't think it was too big of a deal. Moving on now to January, this update was a really solid way to start the year, and this might be a shocker to some of you, but in my opinion, January and most of Feb 2 was the peak of Battlefront 2's lifespan, with a hell of a lot of bugs being fixed, a lot of really good balancing done, and also the addition of Count Dooku, who at the time was pretty much completely bug free. Dooku did drop with not only his base skin but also his Dark Ritual skin from the Clone Wars TV series as well, and like I said, he was really nice and polished when he was released, with smooth animations and being really strong yet not to the point where he was overpowered. As for changes in this update, Geonosis was added to the blast rotation after being out for about 2 months, which was a nice change for any blast players, and as for balancing, this was undoubtedly the best update we've received for hero buffs. Kylo's frenzy ability went from one of the worst to one of the best abilities in the game, yet it wasn't really OP like it is now in that it couldn't break blocks, and it did also have a slightly slower swing speed. So Kylo skyrocketed to being considered one of the better villains in the game, but again not too OP, or at least not yet anyway. Phasma and Finn also saw some really decent buffs. Phasma's staff strikes were changed to pretty much what they are right now, and all around the update was just really great in terms of balancing, and I think that's why I do look back on it so fondly. As for the bugs, this list was pretty much identical to the last month's list. A few things did sort of get slightly fixed but not 100%, with the best example being General Grievous's abilities, where they did improve but would still have some issues every now and then. There was also triple XP every weekend of the month across a wide range of game modes, and so generally speaking this was a really great update, and like I said, it was probably one of the best we've ever had. On the other side of that, the community was still quite angry at DICE about a few things, most of which were to do with Count Dooku. Firstly, we saw no actual promotion for Dooku other than a tease of his lightsaber until after he dropped, and so a lot of people were mad about that since there was a chance to excite some new players. And on top of that, the weekend he dropped, DICE stupidly decided that they're going to lock the heroes to era-specific maps for that weekend. So the first weekend Dooku was out, he was only playable on 4 of the 13 maps in the game, which was obviously not the best decision on DICE's part. Overall, the month was still one of the best without a doubt, and although there were a few bumps, it was definitely a solid update to start the year. Now, moving on, we obviously have February, and this was actually a massive month to follow up on the last one, seeing the addition of the Chosen One Anakin Skywalker, a complete overhaul of the Clone Legion skins, as well as the addition of the Coruscant Guard and 501st Legions, and also the ability to choose Phase 1 or Phase 2 armor regardless of which Clone Wars map you were playing on. Unfortunately, Capital Supremacy was also meant to be dropping, but it did in fact get delayed until March, but we found that out a solid few weeks before this update anyway. We also saw some really nice changes to the stun abilities, reducing the time of the stuns to pretty much just make them less overpowered, as well as Obi-Wan receiving 80% damage reduction during his force push, and another hefty buff to Kylo's damage output too, which is where he did kind of start to become a little bit overpowered. As for the bugs, again, it was pretty much the same list that we saw in the previous months. These bugs had started to become pretty annoying, and the fact that they weren't getting fixed was starting to cause some serious frustration within the community. Luckily, none of them were game breaking, but they were annoying nonetheless. Again, DICE didn't seem to learn from the previous month's mistakes, with another event which reduced the amount of content we could play on, limiting the more popular game modes to only have the Clone Wars content playable over the weekend that Anakin was launched, and the community yet again was not a fan of this. Now, there is also the elephant in the room of Anakin being extremely overpowered when he launched, and for those who weren't around back then, he was literally able to one-hit kill all 20 enemies on the other team, including heroes if they were all grouped around him. I actually had some 18-man multi-kill submissions for the top 5 play series within 1 or 2 days of him launching, and even I had a 90 kill streak with him on day 1, which for my skill level was just completely unheard of for me, so that just shows exactly how powerful he was. For the first few weeks, honestly, it wasn't that bad as he just was a lot of fun to use, but the novelty wore off pretty quickly, and this did spark one of the most frustrating and controversial periods of the game, probably since the loot box fiasco. So overall, the update was pretty decent in terms of what we got, but the feeling around the community was very much the opposite, at least after a week or 2 anyway. Now, moving on to March, obviously we finally saw the addition of Capital Supremacy, the new large-scale game mode, which was our first real sandbox type of game mode in Battlefront 2. Taking the best parts of Conquest and also adding a touch of the Supremacy feel to it by making it a little bit of a tug of war as well. On top of that, we also saw the addition of the ARC Trooper and the BX Commando, which were kept a secret until only a few weeks before this update, and they were really well received and to this day are probably some of the more enjoyable characters in the game. We also got Dooku's third appearance, which was his exquisite pajamas skin available for 40,000 credits, as well as the first of the Anakin nerfs, which to be honest was not all that effective. It did remove his ability to one-hit kill full health heroes, which was great, but it didn't really stop him from being head and shoulders above all the other characters. Geonosis was also added to the Hero Showdown rotation after being out for 5 months, which people were somewhat pleased about but also annoyed that it had taken so long, and then we did also see some nice hero buffs as well, so there were some nice little additions there. As for bugs, again, it seemed to be pretty much the same list of bugs. Some were fixed in this update, but there was also the addition of a few crashes in the Capital Supremacy mode where players couldn't actually spawn into the capital ship phase of the mode, essentially resulting in dead lobbies where everyone would just have to back out and start looking for another, so that did put a dampener on the newest addition to the game. Overall, the update was a really solid update in terms of the content we received, and in fact it's still to this day probably one of the biggest updates in terms of the content. Capital Supremacy was a big hit when it was working anyway, the new reinforcements were absolute fan favourites, and a few of the changes were very much welcomed as well, so in terms of all of that, the update was a huge success. There was still the issue of Anakin being so overpowered, and again it did bring the month down as a whole. People were extremely frustrated to play as the dark side since they just got destroyed game after game, and so despite the great update overall, it definitely was not a perfect update either. Moving on now to April, and this was a little bit of a slower month overall, but we did also get our first proper announcement of the new Star Wars game Jedi Fallen Order, as before this all we really had was a small announcement about 10 months earlier, but this was actually the first trailer and the first look at the game anyway. As for Battlefront 2, we saw Kashyyyk get added to the Capital Supremacy rotation, which was a really nice addition, and despite the community being a bit on the fence since it was almost a direct port of the GA version, overall it was definitely welcomed. This month also saw Yoda and Darth Maul receive their block abilities as well, which was a huge request from the community, and on top of that there was another Anakin nerf, a Chewie buff, and some other nice changes as well. As for the bugs this month, this was actually a really good month for the bug fixes. A lot of those recurring bugs were finally fixed for the most part, but there were a few that stuck around, the worst of which were the Capital Supremacy crashes. Overall, this was a pretty small month content wise, but we had just come off 2 massive months, and I think the bug fixes really did make this update better than it would have been otherwise. Moving on now to May, and again this month was actually pretty small content wise, definitely not the smallest we'd had but not the biggest either. We saw Kamino added to the Capital Supremacy playlist, which was mostly pretty well received, and we did also get a surprise skin in the Princess Leia appearance, which was able to be unlocked via the first community challenge so far, where as a community we had to capture 4 million command posts across a 5 or 6 day period. On top of that, Anakin was finally nerfed to a point where he was bearable. The target system was removed from heroes vs villains, and the level caps were increased to 1000 as well, which was something we'd all been wanting for a long time. There were also a few decent buffs as well, Boba Fett and Phasma being the main characters that saw some really good changes, as well as just some general hero tweaks and fixes too. As for bugs, a whole heap of the previous bugs that were fixed last month seemed to find their way back in somehow, and so despite a pretty positive update overall, this one was once again plagued by bugs which the community was not very happy about. Moving on now to June, and this was a very solid month in terms of content, getting Theed added to Capital Supremacy, the addition of the fan favourite droidicas, as well as the new vehicle for the Republic known as the TX-130. Theed was really well received overall. The TX-130 was hit and miss in terms of the fact that it was a vehicle, but one thing that was widely disliked was how weak the droidicas felt on launch, as they were definitely a little bit hard to use. Personally, I thought they were fine for the most part, other than just being slightly underpowered, but it was mainly due to the way that they played rather than their actual power, so eventually people did learn to play them a little better. We also saw the change of every hero getting their health on kill cards made exactly the same to make it much more balanced, as well as Luke and Yoda buffs as well, which was maybe a little bit too much, but overall people did seem very happy. Again, there were a lot of those same bugs going on, and at this point it was just pretty much expected. The community was just beyond tired of these bugs, but simply because there was new content, people were still excited to play regardless. Aside from those bugs and the droidica debacle when they launched, this was a really positive update overall, and on top of this, the day before EA Play they did actually reveal Felucia would be added down the line too, which was also some very exciting news. Moving on to July, however, this was again just a very controversial month, which at this point just really was not needed for the game, and after months and months of these recurring bugs, we saw essentially no content this month as the devs decided to take another holiday, and again, they are regular people and they do deserve time off like everyone else. But the community was definitely annoyed since a lot of people had finished with schooling and stuff like that, only to come back to pretty much an empty month. We saw animated victory poses and voice lines added for Yoda, Obi-Wan, Maul and Grievous, and aside from some small bug fixes, that was honestly it for this month, and like I said, the community was just not happy about this month at all, which was probably more than fair, and honestly this may have gone down as one of the worst months since the game launched. Moving on to August, this was a month that really did need a positive reaction and some decent content, and I can't say that anything we got was really bad, but it was just another somewhat lackluster update since the devs were obviously just getting back from another holiday. We saw 3 new droid skins, the pilot, jungle and training appearances, and we also saw contextual spawning for Capital Supremacy, meaning you could just spawn on command posts, which overall was a great addition, but again, this was something that really should have been in the game since the mode launched back in March, taking 4 or 5 months to add one of the most pivotal aspects of pretty much any conquest mode, so overall the community was kind of 50-50. We also saw the addition of passive health on kill, which had been requested for months if not years, so this was probably the highlight of this update, at least for me anyway, and despite the lack of content it did definitely help the update overall. As for the bugs, there were actually some pretty decent fixes for this month, but again we were left with some smaller saber combat issues again, as well as pretty much the same old stuff from previous months as well. Overall, this was kind of just one of those updates that was okay, but at the end of the day it was nothing special either. Now, in absolute contrast to August, September was an enormous update and probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest update since launch. Felucia was added to the game in the form of a new CS map, and it was received extremely well by the community, being probably one of the fan favourite maps, and it was definitely a really great addition to the game. We also got the Clone Commando as a reinforcement as well, and despite being a fair bit overpowered to start with, these were also really well received other than that, and they were a whole lot of fun to play as. We also got some huge additions in the form of the new 4-player co-op mode and instant action for all those offline players as well. And these were surprisingly some of the best additions to the game since launch, honestly, which not a lot of us had really expected, as most of us are just here for the multiplayer stuff, but these new modes were extremely well received. There were also some nice changes to the speed of damage output, and they added AI heroes and villains as well, which was another really nice addition since instant action was finally here. In terms of bugs, the Clone Commandos were a tad buggy and overpowered, as they did have 50% damage reduction on their middle ability rather than 25. And again, they were just the regular bugs that everyone was still sick of. A lot were fixed, but there were also some new ones, so again, really nothing was improved here. Overall, this would have to be one of the best updates we had received so far. The new modes and Felucia were so well received, and heading towards the end of the year, there was a very good vibe around the community. Now, moving on to the last real month of content for this video, and compared to the last one, this was a lot slower content wise, but at the same time it wasn't really terrible either. We saw the highly requested Farm Boy Luke skin added, which looks really good and was really well received. And then we also saw the Han and Luke ceremony skins added a few weeks later as well. And so all up, we did get 3 very nice skins, and the fact that there was finally some OT content rather than Clone Wars content, most people were pleased in that regard. Felucia was also added to the HVV rotation, and Ewok Hunt did make a little comeback with a new map added and some small changes to the mode as well. As obviously October means it's Halloween time, and so DICE did want to go with a little bit of a spooky theme for the month, which obviously can be the case sometimes in Ewok Hunt. As for the bugs though, honestly this may very well have been one of the worst months since November 2017, as there were regular crashes for over 10 days after the update, completely killing some of the smaller player bases like Australia and Japan, as it was just impossible to play a game without crashing straight after, and therefore no one was really playing, which was definitely very frustrating. Eventually it was fixed of course, but this crashed bug did honestly deal a fair amount of damage to the game, and the playbase seemed to have a massive dip for a good couple of weeks there, as like I said, it was just impossible to find a game, and with some other games like Modern Warfare coming out, a lot of people just seem to kind of move on or take a break. The content itself wasn't terrible, but if I'm going to be completely honest, I think this update was probably one of the worst since launch in terms of the ramifications, which was pretty unfortunate heading into the end of the year. Now, we are of course in November as I'm making this video, and we did just get news last week that there's actually no update this month, and that we will be getting 2 in December instead, so for this month there really isn't anything to cover. They haven't really explained why it's being pushed back yet, but Ben did mention that it's pretty much not for any bad reason like the content isn't ready or there's a bug or something like that, so I am very intrigued to hear what the go is for December. Now, taking a look back at all the content we've received throughout the last 12 months, I have to say that I am really pleased with DICE's work and dedication to this game. If you had told me in April of 2018 when I started this channel that I'd still be making 3 videos a week on all the new Battlefront 2 content, I genuinely would have laughed in your face, but here we are and the game is still being supported for the foreseeable future, however long that may be. Regardless of the launch and what everyone says about the game, I think we really do have to sit back and just appreciate all this content that we have been given, considering the game was on the brink of death at one point there, and now here we are still plugging along, and hopefully we will see support for another year, because this player base is just so dedicated, and I'd hate for this game to end all of a sudden towards the start of 2020. On the other side of things, despite all that content, the game has been filled to the brim with bugs since day one, and to be honest, I have just given up on any hope that I had of the bugs ever being fixed, because honestly, I just don't think that's ever going to happen if it hasn't already. The bugs and issues within this game really have held back a lot of its potential, and it is so frustrating to think how insane this game could be. If there was never the loot box drama and the game was never filled with bugs, it genuinely could have been one of, if not the best Star Wars game of all time. Despite all its flaws, I really do love this game still, and like I said, I hope it can be supported for another 12 months. Whether that happens or not, I honestly have no idea, but one thing I do know is that I definitely think DICE should go ahead with supporting this game for as long as financially possible, because at the end of the day there's still such a loyal player base, and it really would be a shame for us all to have to move on and find something else to play until the next multiplayer Star Wars game. Overall, I would say this year was a pretty successful one for the game, but I'm definitely keen to hear what you guys think, so be sure to let us all know down in the comments your thoughts about the year as a whole after seeing this video. I am going to leave it there guys, as this is a bloody long video. If you did enjoy this one, then make sure to subscribe and hit that like button down below to help support the channel. Thank you all so much for watching, and here's to hopefully another year of support for Star Wars Battlefront 2.